Welcome, everyone. I know it always takes a few seconds for people to come in out of the waiting room, so we'll get started in about 30 seconds. We're happy to have you here today. All right, let's get started. Welcome to today's Alumni Career Webinar, The Successful Board Candidates Roadmap with Mark Pfister. I'm Maura Sweeney, Director of Alumni Career and Professional Development at Holy Cross, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar, offered exclusively for the Holy Cross community. We'll be together for an hour, and after the formal presentation, Mark will take questions from you for as long as time allows. I encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A function located on your webinar control panel. This presentation will be recorded and shared with participants shortly after the presentation. Now I'm happy to introduce you to today's speaker. Mark A. Pfister is a governance and strategy expert, a non-executive director, and a chief board consultant who has consulted and advised hundreds of public, private, PE, and nonprofit boards. He is known as the board architect for his work in defining the structural components of effective boards. He's a best-selling author with circulation in over 70 countries and the creator of the International Board Director Competency Designation, a globally recognized board and board director education and certification. I have been looking forward to this webinar ever since Mark and I first started talking last spring, and I am delighted to hand things over to Mark for the next hour. Mark, thank you very much for being here.
Maura, thank you so much, and I'm glad to see this topic resonated with your audience, so I'm excited to talk about it today. It's a favorite topic of mine, so hopefully my passion comes out in our discussion today. So thank you for the nice introduction as well. All right, let's jump into it if we're ready to go here. So I'd like for you to know what topics we're going to cover and the reason for those topics. So let's talk a little bit about our goals for today and what I'd like you to walk away from today's discussion. So number one, I want you to understand what your board director viability is. This is a big topic of conversation. I wanted to dispel some rumors around this area as well, and we'll get into some of those topics. I also want to talk in number two here about the all-important board candidate packaging. There may be some quite surprising things I bring up to you here. And with my experience of having worked with hundreds of boards and hundreds of nominating committees around the world, I can tell you what we're looking for in the background, all the way relating to your first submission, what we see as your first impression. We'll talk a little bit in number three here about board candidate pre-work. How should you prepare? What are we looking for? What should you be looking for in the pre-work before an interview? And number four, the board interview readiness. This is very important. This is really where we see if what was submitted in what we call your board documents, your first impression, do they match with you as a candidate when we see you in person? And then we'll talk about number five, the opportunity decisioning process. And the big point to make here, that we will make here, is that it's not just about getting to the point where the board offers you the position and you say yes to it. How are you equally vetting the opportunity to make sure it's going to be something worth your while, something you're passionate about, and something you can be successful with? All right. Let's first, as I mentioned, talk about your board director viability. So I want to start with saying that there's some really interesting reports that have come out over the years, and I'm usually glued to these when they're launched and they're published. So I've been looking at this for years now. The 2024 report looked at new board directors added to Fortune 500 boards in 2023. This is a report that's issued yearly from Heidrick and Struggles. It's called the Board Monitor US. This is from the 2024 study that looked at 2023. And we're seeing some really interesting trending over the last 2, 3, 4 years in this, when we see higher and higher percentages, or I should say a high percentage of directors that are being appointed to the Fortune 500 boards in the US, and they went to first-time public company directors. This is really unheard of. I can tell you in 2022, that number was 43%. So boards are open now to get those that are not preconditioned, I'll say, or those that don't have prior public company board experience. They're looking for modern day, what we call modern day experience or leadership experience. This is a great trend. It's really offering up a significant number of opportunities. We'll talk a little more about why these opportunities are coming up. Now, on top of that, there are areas within this trending that we see as really great opportunities or deeper opportunities. If you're focused in technology or cybersecurity, human capital, or risk areas, really compliance, we could say, in that space as well. These are really areas of leverage for you if you package yourself properly. We'll talk a little bit about that packaging today. So the main point of this area of the reporting is that the trending is in your favor. We talk in our course about this also, that even the baby boomer retirement is causing a significant number of available openings. The most board openings we've seen ever in the history of the world is happening right now as it relates to opportunities across all different sectors, all industries, and all board types right now. It's a great time to be involved in this. Who are boards looking for? So modern boards have truly realized the value in looking deeper into areas of importance that may not have been looked at in the past. And this is true of many boards not looking at these in the past. So designing a board with mixed industry makeup. We're going to talk shortly about what we call board architecture. And to cut to the chase in this area, a modern day board should not be made up of more than 25% of individuals with background in the industry in which that company serves. That may sound surprising, but think about the expertise that you get on a board within an organization by having other industries represented and best practices from those industries. We're also looking for leadership and deep operations experience, of course. Now, leadership was a given here for since the beginning of time, but the deep operations experience is fairly new in that we're looking for those that have the ability to right size, as we say, right size their strategies. And a good example of this is someone who comes with maybe very large company experience. They can apply large company strategy to large companies, but if they're now serving on a board of a mid-size or a small-size company, they can't right-size that particular strategy at the operations level of the organization. We are looking at that deeply today because we know that is a major component of success for individual directors as well as a group of directors. We're also, of course, looking at historically underrepresented directors. This comes back to the diversity of the board. We're not just looking at what we would view today as maybe the more focused on diversity areas, but what we're mainly looking at is the diversity of perspective, which leads to diversity of thought, which leads to elevated outcomes. This spans a very large range of what we would consider to be historically underrepresented directors. Deep strategy knowledge and governance knowledge or background. These are huge areas for boards today. Many people claim they have deep strategy knowledge and deep governance background, but when some of the interviews are done, we can tell that even those with lofty titles don't know how to make the correlation properly at the board level of the interrelationship between strategy and governance. We'll talk a little bit about that today also. And also specialized vertical knowledge directors. We've come from a realm for many decades that a broad view or a broad brushstroke or a horizontal view of leadership is what's needed on all boards. We have moved away from that. Yes, it's important. Yes, we want that. But in addition, we want specific vertical knowledge directors. This is a way that you leverage your expertise and your experience in what we call, again, a vertical in addition to your horizontal knowledge, which relates more to the broad brushstrokes and maybe looking at something from the end to end rather than one expertise area. So all of this, for those in the audience today that are hearing this, should be quite excited because these are things that bring opportunity or open up opportunity for what was historically a pretty closed environment and a very an environment with lots of nepotism that was happening in how board seats are being appointed. We're not in that realm anymore, and we see that through the trending and in what's happening in basically all industries today. So as we talk about your board director viability, your ability to commit time to this is quite important. This is one of the big questions that comes up for most of those trying to break into the board director realm as board candidates. And I would even say that many so-called experienced directors don't really have an understanding of what it takes in terms of time commitment. So I will say this. I have never seen a board director, a successful board director, put in less than 250 hours per year per board they serve on. We've seen this as an issue really as it came out in COVID times when directors, some directors were what we call overboarded. They were serving on so many boards that they weren't able to not only not commit 250 hours, but under times of crisis, which typically requires more time, they weren't able to be present in these meetings, sometimes called on an ad hoc basis. Make sure you have the ability to put the time in, make sure you know the breakdowns of this. The reason we say 250 hours is that your universal base duties typically take up on average around 200 hours per year. And we strongly caution you not to join a board where you're not committed to a committee. So we add the 50 hours in there as serving on at least one committee. Know that if you're serving on multiple committees, we typically add more time to this based on this particular chart. One of my interview go-to questions when I'm evaluating a particular board candidate is to ask them, what time commitment do they expect on this board? I'm looking for something that's very close to what I'm mentioning here. Make sure you have the time. You're going to need it, especially in today's world with a lot of the changes and the research that's required in your role. Incidentally, going back for a moment, when you get a copy of this presentation along with the video, you'll be able to click on some of these links here as well to get to some articles that are along the lines of topics I'm discussing here. All right, so let's move into your board candidate packaging. This typically leads to a lot of aha moments for those that are trying to break into the board realm or that are already board directors but are wondering why they're not getting appointments on other boards currently. So first thing, this is a big one. Never submit a regular bio or a resume or a CV for a board role. This is not the correct way to do it. Know that a resume was originally designed for employee level positions. What better way to show that you're not leadership than to submit a resume format document for a senior leader or officer level position in an organization? We call these board documents, or the proper submission is called board documents. And I'll give you the breakdown of those in just a moment. But remember that one of the biggest ways for me as an evaluator to understand if you are board director material, even before you have the ability to represent yourself in person, potentially in an interview, is have you submitted properly? Are you submitting a resume or calling it a resume or a CV? Know that we don't do that. There's examples of this all the time. I have a client I'm working with right now in their nominating committee. They had set over 720 submissions for an open board role. Only 12 of them so far have submitted properly. You can guess which submissions I'm going to review. So when I say board documents, what does that actually mean? Board documents with an S make up two specific documents. Your board bio. Do not confuse your board bio with a professional bio. It is a different layout, different format. And also within your board documents is a document called your board document. I know it's a little confusing, but it is what it is. And I'll show you some of the breakdowns here. So know that whether you're being requested to send a resume, a CV, a bio for a board role, in the back of your mind, whether that person or that organization is using the proper terminology or not, you should still be thinking and knowing that you're going to submit your board documents for this. I mentioned a moment ago that your resume or CV guide you down a path of sounding more like management and less like leadership or governance material. Put the effort into this. We'll talk at the end of today's presentation of different outlets or an outlet that we provide to create the proper board documents for your submission for board opportunities. Now, what does this mean? At the high level, just touching at the broad brushstroke levels right now, a board bio follows more of a funneling type of effect in the readability of it. So professional bio typically starts out very broad, it narrows down and then goes broad again at the bottom, talking about education as an example, as the close of your professional bio. We don't do that in board bios. We typically get down to the funnel, which shows how all of your expertise and experience aligns to what we call the workhorses of the board, which are the committees. You want to make sure your board bio follows that particular flow. A board document is similar in that it follows a funneling effect, but unlike a resume where you're listing things in an order of the years in which you worked for these organizations in a specific role following specific duties, we don't do it that way with board documents. There's no reason that I, as an evaluator, should have to sort through your resume to pull out the things that are pertinent to board directorship. The way we do it in proper board document format and submissions is that we separate these out and we start with what's called a board profile. It's a very short summary paragraph of your expertise and your experience. We then pull out any previous board and board committee experience. If you don't have that, don't worry. We move to what's called board level experience, the times at which you've either helped someone in your organization present to a board, you yourself are presented to a board. You're basically showing your interaction at the board level, not necessarily you serving as a director. And you'll see how we move down the chain here of the importance of these areas, leading to also what we like to think is differentiators in your core leadership traits, which point out your demeanor, and anything also that relates back to your education or certifications. The more specific they are to senior leadership areas in terms of education and certifications, the better. So I know I'm only scratching the surface on this, but the point of this is to really get across the need for you to put the effort into creating proper board documents. It's one of the easiest ways me and others as evaluators know if you've even done your homework on the research or done the research to know what to submit. We can easily make the correlation. If you haven't spent the time to do the research and the work in creating board documents, are you going to spend the time to do the research and the work in the boardroom? Remember that correlation. All right, let's talk a little bit about the board candidate pre-work. So let's say that you submitted successfully, you got to the interview. Make no mistake, in today's world, I believe it is harder to get to the interview than it is to get the appointment. And I'm not saying that backwards. I believe it's harder to get to the interview than it is to get the appointment. Once you get the interview, that role for you it's yours to win if indeed you're following proper areas of research and preparing yourself for the interview. So know, number one, that if you're doing your research, I'm going to use a US example here, but this is true for, the process is true for any company around the world. Just some of the terminology here, the forms are going to be different. You have a ton of research to do before going for an interview. I know that I asked very specific questions of the organization's background, even things that were submitted maybe a year or two ago in their annual reports or their proxy statements to see if that individual candidate is aware of what this company is doing or the challenges this company has if it's public. Typically, the Form 8K, as an example, in the US, has to be filed if there's any type of materiality disclosure that will affect the share price or could affect the share price or shareholders in the organization. What better way to do your research on the challenges of that potential or that public organization than by seeing what Form 8Ks they filed over the last 3 years? Do you see a trend in those? Is there an expertise area that you can bring to the board to help out with those issues? Private companies, a little bit harder to get information on, only because they're not required to disclose some of the same information as public companies. But in today's world of social media and postings and the internet, of course, we can find out a ton of information on private companies also. It may not be as formulated or as structured, but this all comes back to your need to do the research and find this information to make sure you're going in as a candidate who's informed. Nonprofit organizations, another really easy way in the US to find out information. They're required to file Forms 990, the annual reports, and most nonprofits issue on a yearly basis their goals and their strategic plan. No excuse for going to an interview without having this information. As an evaluator, I know very quickly when I open up the floor to the candidate to ask any questions they may have. If I'm being asked questions that are already available in the public domain, I can already tell that person has not done their homework. Another great way for a board to show their prowess and how great they are in the organization is, and to give a structure to a board candidate so the interview goes to more deeper levels of value in the evaluation process, is for a board to issue what's called a board pitch book, or what's sometimes called a board director invitation. This is put together by the board, usually issued by the nominating committee, and includes information, some of it pretty basic, but at least it's all in one spot. Things from who we are, what we will become, that's the mission and the vision, the values of the organization, if there's a credo that talks about the mantra of the organization, the industries or the overlap of industries being served, all the way to the board structure. We're going to talk in a moment a little bit about board architecture, but where would you as a board candidate fit? Show the overall architecture of that board, which I like to say more so than structure. This is really a great way for the board itself to get their act together and to portray a vision of what they expect, the expectations. I spoke a moment ago about time commitment. Time commitment is another one that I like to include in a proper board pitch book. So You can evaluate the maturity of an organization's board by what they issue you for the organization or for the opportunity. Okay. I mentioned a moment ago about the board architecture. What does that encompass? Board architecture, I've spent a good portion of my professional career digging into this, looking for examples, doing the research. I'll show you in a moment a book I wrote about this, but there's really three areas. We call that the sphere of influence. That's typically focused on the skill set, competencies, and expertise areas. That's where most boards focus, but they stop there. That is the vertical areas of expertise. We also now in modern day board architecture focus on what's called planes of congruence. These are the horizontals. Horizontals include things such as a balance of personality types across a board, looking for, at the simplest level, a balance of an analyst, a diplomat, a sentinel, protector, or explorer. You can see how if you're a board of a certain type of personality type or background, you're likely going to be looking for people that are similar to you. That's not a good thing when it comes to boards. You want a diversity of thought, which leads to diversity of perspective. And coverage and balance in this specifically talks about, do I have one person with a specific expertise? That's a good example in today's world is cybersecurity. Many boards are adding cybersecurity experts on their board. Well, when that cybersecurity expert proposes something or gives background on a specific topic, the rest of the board is sitting around with their mouths open. They don't know what to comment on. We want to make sure that we don't have these silos of information and proposals in boards. So we focus on something called coverage and balance. This ensures that there's more than just one individual for topics that the board needs to discuss that's pertinent to that business, that organization, that there's more than just one person that can add value to that discussion or to that vote. Know that 90% of board-related challenges and failures are directly related to the board's architecture. This is one of the major findings of our study, or my study in my book. This isn't a sales pitch, but if what I'm saying is interesting to you, you can read through my book. You can pick up a copy of it. It's also included already in the course that we'll talk about at the end of the program. There is a huge correlation to the success, both the current success and the future success of a board, to its architecture. It should absolutely weigh into your decision making on whether or not you apply for a specific board role. And if you say yes to that board role, I can't stress enough the importance of the architecture components, the structure of that board. I know we're moving pretty quickly here, but we're a little limited on time. I want to mainly give you the background areas to focus in, which then you can further your research and your knowledge in these spaces if board directorship is in your future sites. Board interview readiness. So board interviews should not just be one-sided conversations where an evaluator asks you a question and you answer that question and you're waiting for the next question to come up. What we're really looking for in this is there a dynamic discussion? Are you, as the board candidate, driving the conversation to things that are important to the board and to the individual evaluator? So I can tell you first off, without going into, and I'm not the squishy feely type of guy when I talk about values, what I'm looking for here is the basic understanding that values equal culture of an organization, which equals the risk level of the organization. This is, again, something we go into in depth in our training and our education and certification area. This is something, if I don't hear this from a candidate early on, the importance of the values leading to the culture, the desired culture, to the risk of the organization, I already know that that individual is lacking some basic foundational areas of knowledge as it relates to risk of an organization, directly relating under the governance umbrella. You also need to know exactly where you fit. We call this your majors and your minors. Are you bringing a certain expertise or multiple expertise areas to the board, such as your major, where you've been focusing in your professional career? Your minors are areas we correlate to the workhorses of the board, which are your committees. Are you actively telling me that even if I'm only looking for a fit on one committee currently, are you able to show me that you're not just a one-trick pony and you can serve, if needed, on other committees of that board? We typically like to see 3 of those. Strategy and governance, we talked about this a moment ago in some earlier slides, the importance of showing your prowess in the strategy and governance area and the interrelationship of them. I'm going to share with you a quick question I ask in all of my interviews, and either fortunately or unfortunately, I've become known as the 10-minute interviewer, because if If you're being interviewed for a board role and you cannot answer this question, which I ask in the first 10 minutes of a board interview, I end the interview at 10 minutes. Here's the question. Tell me about your understanding of the interrelationship between strategy and governance. There should be no hesitation in the answer of that question when that question is asked. And the reason for that is that the answer to that question, which I'll share with you some of the background on that in a moment, the answer to that question tells me if you're going to be effective and efficient in the boardroom. Some of the best leaders in the world right now that feel that they have the rite of passage because they were the best CEO and they've grown their company tenfold make the worst board directors because they cannot answer that question or apply that question effectively. You also want to make sure you have a learning mentality. There was a belief for many years that once you reach the board role, you reach the epitome and the peak of your career, and there's no more need for learning. There's no better way for us as evaluators to know if you are of high ego than to say that you feel that you know everything. And we know that also appointing directors that feel they know everything wrecks the camaraderie of a board. We know not to make those mistakes. You want to make sure that you're not only of a learning mentality, but you're living that by continuing your learning. One thing I can say is that for being a director, I've realized that there's not enough time left in my life to learn everything that I need to know. Going back to that old phrase that the more I learn, the less I know. That is the type of ability or the type of personality you want to convey, that you understand that the learning is exponential that's required to be a great leader. And something else we call the other intelligences. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Those are things such as EQ, emotional intelligence, MQ, such as mindfulness intelligence, a whole bunch of Q areas, as they call them, that I'll touch on in just a moment. All right, so why are values so important? Many of you know this, but I want to put it more visually right now. Values sits above everything else in the organization. It sits above the vision, it sits above the mission, and all the tactical areas, all the way down to the key performance indicators that you're measuring these tactical areas with. So know that what we stand for equals the culture of the organization, which has a direct correlation to the ethics, the principles, and the beliefs. You never want to be, as a senior leader or a director, in a scenario of a company where you have the best talent, but they're not ethical, and all of a sudden you're testing out your director and officer insurance. We don't want to be stuck in those particular realms. We want to make sure that the values are lived. That is the culture of the organization. Why is this so important? Well, if we look at the visual of the governance model for directors, we know that risk holds the bullseye of this particular chart and of your responsibility areas. Now, don't be confused by this and thinking that risk is only negative. I know it's in red. There is positive risk and negative risk. It's all about knowing what the risk is of entering into those types of scenarios and at least trying to fortify the decisions to minimize the negative risk and leverage the positive risk. But all that being said, right around that risk area, great leaders and great directors know that they can't jump right to the other areas of governance without knowing how the values and the culture affect their decisions and what the values and the culture are within the organization at that point. This is where I like to go again and say, I'm not focused on the touchy-feely aspects of values and culture. I want you to see as leaders that there is a direct correlation to the risk of the organization based on the knowledge and what we say, the livability of the values that equals the culture in the organization. Everything from there is easier to decipher, it's easier to make decisions. There's an understanding of even the operations ability of that organization based on understanding the culture. This is the linkage I want to hear about if somebody claims that they are a governance expert. If you go from governance expert statement and then do not touch on the values and culture linkage, I already know that you're missing the point. This concept I mentioned a moment ago of your major and your three minors, I know I gave you the high level on this. This is a great way to package yourself as a director. Again, another area we go into some depth in the program and the course with. Your major is typically what you primarily do, have done, and commonly includes titles plus expertise areas. And your minors are a way to correlate your expertise areas to committees. So the easiest way to state this is that there's a lot of expertise and experience out there today. But how do you correlate that as a viable candidate to show exactly where you fit on the board into, again, the workhorse area of the board to show where you're going to bring tangible value, not just showing up to a board meeting, giving your opinion every quarter, but what are you doing in between those times to bring value? You want to make that correlation through your minors as it relates to the committee areas or the common committee areas of a board. This all again comes back to the proper packaging and should be included in your board documents, by the way. All right. I mentioned a moment ago, I give you a bigger picture on this strategy and governance area and what this actually means. So anytime you hear strategy ever again in your life, I want you to remember this particular diagram, because strategy is a double-edged arrow that sits in between the goals and the tasks, or as I like to say, your milestones of what you're looking to accomplish. So what does this actually mean? If we drill down further on this, the principle across this is the objective versus the action. And typically somewhere in the middle of the strategy area in discussions and actions is where we see what the tasks are. What tasks do we need to accomplish to create the objective? Now, why is this important? I'm not giving you a strategy lesson right now, but I want to make the correlation here to the leadership aspect. So if I'm in a discussion with a CEO, I want to make sure they're focused at the leadership level on the what and the why as it relates to the goals. Anytime you hear the word strategy, you should immediately jump to how. How are we going to get this done? Many of you may not go to strategic planning meetings anymore because, as you can likely imagine, without the goals already being defined, a strategic planning meeting is useless because you don't talk about the how until you know how that's aligned to the what and the why. And of course, the tasks are the when and the who. That's all great at the leadership level of an organization, understanding that correlation. Here's where many directors or even CEOs that are also on the board get hung up. They miss this pivot, which is the minute they step into that boardroom, they have to move in the goals area from a what and why type of personality or mentality to the goals correlating to the setting and ensuring the relevance of those goals. That is a governance mindset as it relates to goals. When it comes to strategy, most boards should be spending 90% of their time plus in the boardroom on validating the approach of the strategy in support of the goals. This is another big miss of directors right now in not understanding this very simple diagram that's, quite frankly, in simplifying has taken me years to do, but it's a really nice, clean way of looking at this. And then, of course, the tasks or the milestones of the measuring the progress. So many board meetings now, whether it's nonprofit or public companies, they're talking so much about the tasks to measure progress, they've lost the purpose of why they're in that room. They're there to make sure the strategy is still valid, and they're there to make sure that the relevance of that strategy in support of the goals is still there. Keep this in mind. This is probably one of the most important concepts I want to get across today. It is probably one of the areas I would say of most importance where I can evaluate or other evaluators can see if the person interviewing truly understands what they're in the boardroom or going to be in the boardroom to do. And of course, the overlay of this always is budget, scope, and time. There's nothing that falls outside of this. So in tandem to thinking about the goals and the relevance, the strategy and the approach, we should be also doing overlays of that of the budget, scope, and time, which again is our duty as proper directors. All right, we talked about learning mentality. What does that look like? Most are already doing this when they're doing any type of interview. They're thinking in this way, whether you're giving the interview or on the receiving end of an interview. But I want you to think about this a little more in a structured way right now. Think about what we call it a career trifecta. It's a great way to think about this in the board space. Many directors are easily able to get across, or director candidates are easily able to get across their experience, how they've applied their knowledge or their expertise. Where they typically struggle, however, is how do they show their modern day expertise or their know-how? And above and beyond what you say as the candidate, who from the outside, a third party unbiased body, is also saying that, yes, we agree that they are a great candidate because they have this certification. I want you to start thinking about this in the board space right now, to not say that a certification is not necessarily going to land the board seat, but I can, as its sole decisioning point, but I can tell you in 3 of the 5 recent appointments I've been involved with on boards, where the expertise and the experience have been quite close. Even if you remove the name from their submissions, you wouldn't be able to tell who was who. It was the education and the certification areas that we had to move into to make the decision for the appointments. So above and beyond just the modern day knowledge through certification and education, we also know that person is what? Likely of low ego because they are understanding they have to continue their education. Whether that's the case or not, we at least know we're hedging our bet or minimizing our risk by making that assumption and maybe probing a little further in the interview. You get the point of where I'm going with this. We're looking for a process. We utilize this process. You should build out your career trifecta as it relates to any professional area of focus, especially in the boardroom. It will be a defining moment of the decision making for someone like me that's sitting on the other side trying to figure out who's the best candidate. I love this quote by Darwin Smith. He was the prior CEO of Kimberly-Clark. Love this quote. "I never stopped trying to be qualified for the job." He is the epitome of somebody that kept the ongoing learning mindset, the continuous learning mindset, and was just a sponge for learning and asking questions, asking the right questions across his organization. He was not just one of those leaders that stuck in his office and leveraged information from his direct reports. He was out in the environment. He's really someone great to study. Okay. The other intelligences. Most people have heard of EQ, emotional intelligence. We like to think of that as the reactive side to a response. Somebody gets heated, they're in your face. Do you get heated also in your response? Typically, we will say that that's the reactionary side of someone's personality. The one I would tell you is of equal importance, especially in senior leadership roles, is MQ, mindfulness intelligence. This is the proactive side. This is you recognizing what's happening around you. Is there a certain director on your board that is typically very engaged that is now seems distant or they're not involved in the meeting? Are you able to recognize that? If that person is some way assigned to helping you make a point for something that's going to come to vote in the board, do you table that so you can take a break in between to talk to them offline and ask them what's bothering them currently and how you can support them before you go to some proposal that you're making? That's mindfulness intelligence. EQ is actually, I believe, useless without the MQ side in senior leadership. We also look at TQ, or team intelligence. And another big one I will tell you that I was quite disappointed that I felt had to be added to this is adversity intelligence. Think about this as someone's grit. And we would like to think that by the time someone reaches a level of senior leadership or officer level in an organization, of course, grit goes along with that. They've had to really put in the work to get to where they are. That is not the case today. We cannot make that assumption. Nothing was a better indicator of this than the COVID times when many companies were going through major heartache and hardship. There were a lot of directors that showed that they did not have grit. You have to show a way of getting this across. You want to have examples and instances where maybe you did have to roll up your sleeves as an officer of an organization to get more involved. These are things that show your grit in the organization. You need to get that across to show that you're a great director. All right, I'm going to do a quick time check, Myra, to make sure here. I think we're going to be good. So your opportunity decisioning process. So I mentioned earlier, and I know we covered a lot here and we're scratching the surface, but I want to give you the full realm of things to consider, and you can take this to whatever level you would like. In the decisioning process, you should not be of the mindset that you're simply hoping to be offered the role that you're going to immediately say yes to. That's not the way this should work. There's something that we call appointees or appointment remorse. And this is for a director that is so happy they've been appointed, and within the first 3 to 6 months of serving on that board, they have no idea why they made that decision. It's the worst experience of their life. They don't respect the people they work with. It just doesn't work. I don't view that as a shortcoming of the board, quite frankly. I view that as a shortcoming of the candidate. You need to ask yourself some of the right questions and be equally part of the appointment, meaning that 50% of the appointment is the organization of the board offering you the seat, and 50% of it is you saying yes to that. You have an equal, the onus is on you equally to make that proper decision. Ask yourself these questions. Is this board truly successful? You may respond back and say, well, I won't know till I'm on that board. That's an incorrect statement. If you're doing proper research, you can understand if that board's successful. You can look at individual directors. You can look at trajectory of the organization. You can even look at the type of CEO that board has appointed to see if you feel like they made the right decision and the company's going in the right direction. Is this board making a positive impact? Most boards are in a realm of simply putting out fires. And this is not the role of a board to do that. In fact, most cases, the escalations that are reaching the boardroom today are incorrect. The organization is not empowered to make the decisions to stop those escalations from reaching the board. So we want to make sure that the board is focusing its efforts and its time into making a positive impact. Ask yourself these questions. In an interview, ask the board that question. There's nothing wrong with ambiguous questions. You as a candidate can say, how does this board feel they're making a positive impact? And then sit back, be quiet, and listen. See what that board says, or that individual states from that board. And also see if the board is respected. I am a big fan of a board candidate as part of the interview process requesting a one-on-one meeting with the CEO. If you get that, you will understand if that board is respected. Now, a good CEO may not come out and state that they don't respect the board. I'm not saying that, but that the concern areas of the CEO, which they will confide in you with, will tell you if the board is respected or not based on what their actions are and where they're focusing their effort and how they are guiding the CEO. Know that that question is very important. You can get to the bottom of this very quickly as part of any interview or vetting process yourself. Ask yourself the question also, is this board living up to its mission? Is it promoting meaningful action? Is it fostering accountability? Is it conveying trustworthiness? Is it growing networks? I don't just mean this from a standpoint of finding new directors, but if you have an area that's unbeknownst to the board or an area of knowledge that you don't have internally, can you reach out to somebody else? And I like to say also boards should provide mediation. That's either in between directors or within the organization itself through the CEO. This is another skill set I believe is lost today. We're past the point of saying, if you don't agree with me, I'm going to shut down the conversation. You're not able to do that in the boardroom. You have to look out for the shareholders and the stakeholders of that organization. There's no escape. So understand also if the board is truly providing meaningful mediation when there is disagreement with any decisions that are being made. All right, I'm going to take another quick moment here, just touch on the topic of proper board architecture. I want you to know that there is some deeper background to this. If you're interested, as I mentioned, you can read the book on this. This is how it looks. Vertical considerations, these typically correlate to the board's expertise. So what expertise are you bringing to the board? How does that fit into this first area, what we call the sphere of influence? Horizontal considerations, I gave an example a few moments ago on different personality traits or a balance of personality traits on the board. We typically correlate this to the board's character. And depth considerations, this comes back to that coverage and balance topic I talked about. What is the depth of this board? Leverage this, utilize this to truly understand if that board has been architected properly. Remember my statement on the fact that 90+% of a board's issues come back to its structure, or again, I would use the more proactive word, its architecture. Properly architected boards, they help ensure the adherence to the responsibilities simply based on their structure. So know that there is a direct correlation to the effectiveness of a board's governance that relates, I'll say, directly to the structure or the architecture of that board. You should be looking very closely at this for any opportunities that come up. And one last topic, and this is something that many directors, even experienced directors, are not well versed in. Are you protected legally in your role? So we're in this time frame right now where piercing the corporate veil is very easy to do. And this shows that as an officer or director in an organization, you need to be very sure that you are protected in your service to an organization. So first thing to mention is that there are 3 areas of protection typically that come into play. The corporate indemnification, which most of you are likely aware of. This is either in the bylaws of the board, it's in the bylaws or the articles of incorporation of that organization. Then we move into directors and officers, D&O liability insurance. Now, notice that there's an arrow here. meaning that this happens in series. And the biggest liability here typically is when the corporate indemnification runs out or it is not properly covered or you're not properly covered. The D&O may kick in depending on what gaps are covered in that D&O insurance. So let me make a shocking statement right now that may resonate with many of you. I believe that the most at-risk directors serving now across the globe are in nonprofit organizations. Why do I say that? Because most nonprofit organizations do not clearly identify their organization's indemnification, and they do not carry D&O insurance, which means that if a donor sues the organization, they're going to list each director individually. You have to represent yourself out of your pocket. Know that this also correlates to areas of liability as it relates to public, private, even PE directorship. Be aware of this. We again go into depth on the understanding of these areas that they operate in series. And know also you have the ability to pick up your own individual insurance, which is called independent director liability, IDL insurance. This is for the money spent on this, which is not a lot. It is absolutely worth it to have it, even if you're serving on a nonprofit board. There is no reason you should take on high risk in your service to an organization through a board. Do your homework in this, know what's covered, even engage a corporate attorney if need be to look for gaps between the indemnification and the D&O insurance. All right. Just before we go to Q&A, know also that the program I've mentioned a few times in here, which covers all of these topics and many more, includes templating in your packaging and just about everything I think a director needs to know, is available to you. There is the ability to join a group that's a private group for Holy Cross right now. Mara has sent out, I believe, a link and an email to all of you on this. The first promo code has expired as of yesterday, but there's another one that's available right now with a 5% discount if you want to join the group. You also have the ability to join the on-demand or the one-on-one, which you work with me directly. It's an all-encompassing course. We consider it a international course. It's another thing we talk about in the program, that don't go after education and programs that are regional or local. Boards are not looking for that. They're looking for macro directors today that have the macro viewpoint from a global viewpoint. You have the ability to do that through our program. All right. Mara, I think I've spoken or talked everybody's ear off today in trying to fit everything in roughly 45 minutes, but I wanted to give the breadth of what we wanted to talk about today and some of the important areas. So hope it was helpful.
Incredibly helpful. As someone who is brand new to this side of things, I found it fascinating, as I'm sure many people did. We've had quite a great audience sticking with us today.
Good.
I do have a few questions, a few that came in through registration and some that came in through the Q&A. So if you have any questions that have been percolating, by all means, find that Q&A function and submit them there. I'll kick off with one of the first questions that we've got. Do corporate boards value not-for-profit board experience when considering candidates?
They can. And I'll tell you that from two viewpoints. One is in creating your proper board documents. In the board document itself, one of the first areas there is your board and board committee experience. So I would tell you that once you package yourself correctly with your major and your minors, you want to try, if you are going to take that route, you want to try to make sure that you're serving on nonprofit organization boards where you're also serving on committees that you can list that relate back to how you packaged yourself. Now, one of the things I'm known for saying in this, and I like to create a little bit of the conflict with it sometimes just for the discussion, but I believe that as a director of any entity type, public, private, nonprofit, PE, you should never join a board without a correlated committee, at least one that you're serving on. There is no value today to serving on a board and listing yourself as a director at large. It basically means you show up on a quarterly basis, give your opinion, and disappear for a while until the next meeting comes up. The bigger picture here, even as it relates to nonprofit board service, is, of course, make sure it's an area of passion in your life, but also be what we call respectfully selfish also. Join that board knowing that you want to serve on a specific committee because it's going to help your packaging. So don't just join a nonprofit board, join a nonprofit board where you're also correlating your committee service to how you package yourself in your major and especially what we call your minors.
Very helpful. And given that this is an alumni program, major and minor, is very relevant to all of us.
There you go.
Another question came in. What should compensation expectations be for a non-Fortune 500 board versus a Fortune 500 board?
Yeah, yeah, but it's a pretty common question. I'll tell you, we go in depth in this in the course because it not only varies by region. So let me start with all the touch points. We won't be able to get all the topics, but I'll touch on some of the touch points. Know that the highest, excuse me, the highest compensated board roles exist in North America, so between Canada and the US. We start to look at this also as we go through in the course to say what percentages of that are offered in different regions. So for example, if you move that same company down to South America, you're probably looking at 40% of the overall compensation as related to North America. In Malaysia, as an example, you're probably looking at 20 to 30% of the overall compensation as it relates to board service. So yes, I understand if you're looking to make board directorship a career and have a portfolio of companies you work with, you want to definitely weigh in what the earnings capability is of that. Now, to answer the question more directly, public companies on average typically pay more. So if we look at the average of this, usually the cash outlay on average is about $125,000 a year or equivalent, with an equivalent of equity. Now, most boards today are looking to have at least 50% or more of the compensation yearly in the form of equity. Kind of makes sense, right? We want to make sure that our efforts are also representing what the shareholders are doing. So you want to make sure the share price is also up where you want it to be, especially if you're being compensated yearly on that. So it's not out of the ordinary for a director of a Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 company to be around that $250,000 a year all-in compensation package. Some of them do offer sign-on bonuses in the form of equity also, which can be quite lucrative. Now, if we correlate that to private companies, and I hate to be wishy-washy in this, but I have to say it depends. On average, the studies show that the typical cash outlay for a privately held company is between $45,000 and $55,000 a year, with the correlation of some sort of equity compensation, or if they don't have the terminology, they're not using their formatting in terms of equity or shares for a private company, which is the case in most, they do more of a profit sharing type of equity component. But make no mistake, that average is not indicative of the median. So there are companies out there where private company directors are making $500,000 or $600,000 a year because of the position and the growth of those organizations because of the equity component. So the initial cash outlay may be nowhere near where you want to be, but the ability to earn off of that can be quite high. A great example is private equity firms where you can make a fairly good cash outlay. Again, it ranges, so I don't want to throw a number, but you may also be involved in that company that's giving that portfolio company that's paying you in equity shares, and that company's going public in 7 years or 5 years or 3 years. So I have friends of mine, they only serve on private equity boards that have the mission of going public, and it's unbelievable the numbers they clear in an area they're passionate about. So don't just focus on the compensation. The compensation will come with the passion you put into the role.
It's very helpful. Thank you. And it's helpful to see the wide range that's available too.
Absolutely. Incidentally, not to keep referencing back to the course, but we show you how to come up with a strategy if you're looking to join one company or a portfolio of companies. How do you think about that compensation and weigh the time frame of the payouts of those particular roles? Or do you say, you know what, I'm early in my career, I want to get some wins under my belt, I want to show I served on a board for a year or two, and then leverage that to take that further? Sometimes the opportunity value is greater than the cash outlay value. You want to weigh that into this.
Well, and another question came up, kind of similar in this vein, asking, what is the current expectation or practice of a board members give/get?
Yeah, and this is a topic for me as I move my head around right now. You can probably see I don't like this question. Sorry to the person that asked it, but I am not a big fan of a pay-per-play type of scenario when it relates to board directorship. So basically what you're telling me is that you will appoint me to your board based on whether or not I can bring you money. I can tell you that's the wrong way to do this And I get it. Some organizations need their directors to guide and generate some of the revenue. I write about this in my book, and I'm a little brutal about this because it totally sets the wrong expectations. I'm looking for governance and strategy experts, or in the proper order, strategy and governance experts. I'm looking for experts to fill my sphere of influence, the step one in the board architecture. I'm looking for someone to bring a balance of personalities or a balance of industry background. So I would any day take somebody with the knowledge and experience to elevate the organization, for the organization to generate the donations and the grants and those things in a nonprofit, versus having my board directors pay, and I'm limited by who I can have and appoint because it's only those that have the money to spend 10, 20, 100, $250,000 a year to be able to sit on this board. They are not successful models. I can tell you that most of them I wouldn't even consider to be directors based on their knowledge base.
Hmm.
Sorry to be so harsh, but that's what it is.
Well, it's helpful to get a sense of the landscape and some of the decision making behind that too.
I would tell anybody where there's a pay-per-play appointment, that in itself already should be a red flag for how that board operates, because somebody who spends or puts in a lot of money to that organization, there is no incentive for them to realize that they have a role that could be terminated, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I went and spent $250,000 to donate to a board and I decided to show up to one board meeting a year, you think that board's going to terminate me? No. They're going to ask me again to join the next year and wait for my check. It's all of the wrong expectations and behaviors that come from that model.
Hmm. Well, I'm just imagining the inequities that might come about among the board directors because of that model also.
Absolutely. Let me touch on that for a moment, just to further answer this question. One of the biggest areas that creates animosity on a board of directors is a misalignment of the time dedication. So a good example of this, even on a nonprofit, if you're putting in 250 hours a year in your role and the person next to you is putting in 30 and they show up once in a while to a board meeting, do you have the level of respect for that person in their role that's required to create a team that has a camaraderie that's going to drive that organization forward? That is a direct outcome of those that take a little bit of creative license because they feel that they put so much money into the organization that they're guaranteed a position. That's usually how that manifests itself into the time commitment. It's another example of an imbalance in what that board should be focused on.
Hmm. That's helpful. Thank you. We have time for one last question, and this comes to you more from the recruiter seat when you're interviewing candidates or reviewing those documents.
Mm-hmm.
When you receive board documents for a candidate, assuming that they submitted properly and you're not looking at CVs and resumes, what do you look for first, and what makes someone really stand out?
Yeah, yeah. And I'll tell you that the format of the documents actually forces you to do that. One of the things I'm not looking for is, let's give an example of, let's say you're listing in the board document in the third or fourth area, which is your executive or leadership level experience areas. If you have more than 3 or 4 lines in that area, I'm already wondering why you're trying to sell me so hard on that. I just want to know what your title was and where a quick description of your responsibility areas, which, by the way, if you're telling me a C-level title, I kind of already know what your responsibility areas are. It goes back to this story out there when Colin Powell was alive and he was applying for a board role. And the chair of the nominating committee said, Colin, can you just send me something on your background, whatever you got, just submit it over here. And Colin says, I don't really have a resume or a CV or board documents. I'm just going to send you something quick. Colin Powell sent like 3 or 4 sentences. I was joint, whatever, chiefs of staff, and that's all he sent. The point of that is that less is more. The more you try to sell yourself and your accomplishments, the more that makes you sound like management level. So in properly structured board documents and the templating that we supply, we show you that less is more. We limit even the length of these things. A cover letter, no more than 1 page. A board bio, no more than 1 page. Your board document, no more than 2 pages. The hardest part for most people is they have so much expertise and experience. What do they get rid of? So their font size is not 5. So I can tell you every few months I'm back in my board documents and I say, okay, I have more pertinent expertise to add. What do I have to get rid of? It's the hardest decision to make, but do not be the person that tries to show everything you've done since you were 18 years old. It doesn't convey the right level of leadership. Less is more.
I think I've been saying that to people on their resumes for years also. So
Yeah,
some things do
yeah,
carry over from resume to board
that's right.
documents.
That's right. It's going back to that mantra that if you're trying to oversell yourself, what are you hiding?
Hmm.
Rely on the expertise, the experience, and maybe even the titles. I'm not a big title guy, but sometimes just the title itself can convey the right type of experience level. Let those things speak for themselves. The more you try to sell it, the lower I see you more as management than leadership if you do that.
Hmm. This has been absolutely phenomenal, and this hour has flown by.
I can't believe it.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share so much of your expertise and your knowledge with us. As you can see, if you're interested in following up with Mark, his contact information is there on the screen. There's information about the upcoming course, and I'll be sending it in a follow-up email in case you're interested in learning more about that. I want to thank you all for joining us today. As a reminder, this has been recorded and will be emailed out to you. You'll also get a survey that we share out after webinars. We love your feedback. You're welcome to share it in the survey or via email, whichever way is easier for you. And finally, know that these events couldn't be possible without the support of alumni like you and giving to the Holy Cross Fund. Please consider giving a gift today. And if you've already given, thank you. Every dollar counts and makes a real impact on the Holy Cross community. It has been a pleasure to have you today. I hope many of you land wonderful board appointments in the future. Mark, thank you for coming here and sharing all of your knowledge with us today.
Thank you, Mara. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone. Have a great afternoon.